Alright, so let's talk about section 3. We're talking about the first organic molecules. Now, you should have got done with the discussion about the formation of the Earth. Now remember, when the Earth first formed, there was a lot of dust and chaos, and just we didn't have really great environment for life. Luckily enough, we formed this great thing called an atmosphere, which allowed for us to then start to form some of our first organic molecules. Without this, we'd be more like Saturn. Now Venus. Remember with Venus is our sister planet. Carbon dioxide fills their atmosphere. Because carbon dioxide fills the atmosphere, their atmosphere is so heavy that we have only had one country, and that's Russia, send a probe that actually lasted any amount of time on its surface, because it was actually crushing the probes as they went down. And the longest duration it was able to actually keep a probe on the surface of Venus was 90 minutes. So if you think about that, that's crazy. So the pressure that's formed by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can actually crush a probe that's taking pictures. And so we're very fortunate that we have an atmosphere that allows for life to form. And so let's talk about these first organic molecules. Now, remember, when we start talking about these first organic molecules, realistically, do we know for sure? No, and there's absolutely no way. So this is a hypothesis or a theory that's come about, because we just honestly, we don't know what's back there, because we know that the rock has been degrading. We can't take core samples and be super accurate, because we have something called the rock cycle occurring, where rock is being remade and remade and remade. And so basically, we can't tell for sure, but this is what our projections or theory is. Here's what we do know, though. Organic molecules are carbon-based compounds. In order to be organic, you have to have carbon. All living things have carbon. And so we believe that the first organic molecule formed around 4 billion years ago. Now, when you think about first organic molecule, we are looking at things like methane, CH4. Well, methane isn't going to really allow you to live, but it's a carbon compound. And so it was really kind of an important step to look at that. Now, these first carbon compounds, we have 4 compounds listed below that were pretty prevalent, we believe, in the beginning of Earth stages. And that was methane, which is a carbon compound, ammonia, which has nitrogen, hydrogen, water, which is H2O, and carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide, because it does have carbon in it, it is technically an organic compound, but it's not something that can sustain life. However, we are using it for that. And so basically, we had this big bowl of goopy soup with all these 4 wonderful compounds in it, and then lightning, which has a high amount of electricity, was able to spark through the atmosphere, and it actually kind of chemically bounded all of them together to make what we call an amino acid. Now, Urey and Miller were 2 scientists that proposed that, hey, this could actually happen. We could put these 4 gases in the same container, throw a bolt of lightning through it, and we're going to get an amino acid to fall out. And the amino acid would be the first actual organic molecule that we're talking about. And that's where we believe the start of life came from. Now, really with this, amino acid on its own can't do anything. Our body has 20 amino acids that make up every protein that we have in our entire body through a process called, transcription and translation. We remember those. The problem being is when we start looking at all this stuff separately, it doesn't work. Together it can. The only problem with Miller and Urey's experiment, great in theory, they did it, it's really hard to replicate. It has not been successfully replicated by everybody who replicates this experiment. And the factor that's the hard part to replicate is the lightning. Having that amount of electricity and that voltage go through something is really, really hard. Just to recreate a lightning bolt at that same intensity And lightning's not always consistent. Now, you can make lightning bolts. They do it a lot. However, the voltage can change when you're making artificial lightning, and so they can't always get it to work. All right, but that's what they believe the first compounds came from. And these are amino acids. Now, remember, amino acids in combination will make 3 nucleotides need to make up an amino acid. And so basically, once you have your amino acids, then you can make RNA. This ribonucleic acid was what we suggested be the first, genetic information. And once we had the RNA, then came DNA. Now remember, DNA is a double helix, RNA is a single helix, so it makes sense you would have the first half show up before the second. We know that our modern organisms, such as us, we're humans, we're modern, we haven't been around that long, we have DNA. And the more complex organisms all have DNA in them too, so that's pretty cool. When we make RNA, it's a much simpler process. Because you only have to have half the amino acids. You only have to have half of everything. And so it's a little bit easier. So we believe that the first nucleic acids were RNA, not DNA. And if we look at bacteria from the kingdom Archaea, we see that they will contain RNA over DNA. And they're older, much older types of bacteria. So I have a little video that you should have already watched, kind of explaining that a little bit and what's going on for that. So we do know that those are. So remember, our first organic molecules formed about 4 billion years ago. That lightning was needed to spark this reaction, shown by Miller and Urey. Your book has a nice diagram of that, by the way. You can look at that. And then RNA was our first organic molecule that we had. So now let's go on to our first cells. Remember, you can't have a cell until you have this nucleic acid. So we know that the primitive cells are called prokaryotes. We're a eukaryotic organism. We're much, much more complex than those guys. And so our primitive prokaryotic cells were very simple. Again, no membrane-bound organelles, naked DNA with no nucleus. They're going to have RNA and not DNA in them. It's possible that they had a lipid membrane, but we don't know for sure. And so one of the things with the possible RNA containing around the lipid membrane, that could be the plasma membrane, aka the cell membrane, or it could have been a primitive nucleus. We're not really certain for sure that it actually existed, but we're hoping that it did. And so we do know that these first cells were really small, and they probably didn't live on oxygen. So we didn't have a lot of oxygen in our atmosphere. They probably lived on carbon dioxide. And possibly were photosynthetic, like cyanobacteria, which is not actually a bacteria, it's a protist, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the last universal common ancestor probably existed about 3.5 billion years ago, and that was a prokaryotic cell. It lacked a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. It was heterotrophic, which is a huge deal because that means it was using probably oxygen and it was engulfing other prokaryotes and ingesting them, or inorganic compounds. So that's really actually kind of cool. Now, if they ingested inorganic compounds, they did not go through cellular respiration. They were going through chemiosynthesis, which means they can actually take in like sulfur compounds and break it down and make it into energy. But then we can also see that if they engulfed like other prokaryotes, then they were going through cellular respiration. They had to have oxygen, so that could have put oxygen available in the atmosphere at that point, which would have been really cool. Again, can we test all of this? No. We do, however, link back to the common ancestor. So some of you are like, well, how do you know there's the last universal common ancestor? DNA testing. We can actually test the DNA now of like us And we can trace back our origins. So we're able to do it with bacteria and other things too. And so we can actually make these huge phylogenetic trees that show where our common ancestor is. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis are the two huge developments that allowed for modern day organisms to occur. Photosynthesis, we'll talk about that one first. Photosynthesis happened about 3 billion years ago in our little bacteria cells, not plants. Plants on land did not just appear right away. It happened in these little individual cells, and plants on land came much, much later. They were able to make their own food from carbon dioxide and sunlight, and they're able to produce the first oxygen into the atmosphere. Now, photosynthesis, not a super great process because it's not efficient. The problem with photosynthesis is because they're so, well, it's a good thing and a bad thing. It needs a lot of carbon dioxide to function correctly. On primitive Earth, that was perfect. We had tons of carbon dioxide. It was everywhere. Volcanic eruptions galore. And so we were able to have all of this going on. It wasn't an issue. But it produced oxygen. And oxygen to photosynthetic organisms is actually toxic. And so what they were doing to produce, use and make energy was actually a byproduct, was killing them. But we can say the same for us for cellular respiration. If you stick us in a room full of carbon dioxide, it's not going to be a pretty picture of what happens in about 6 minutes. Because we're not going to live either. Cellular respiration happened much later. Cellular respiration was a huge evolutionary advancement over photosynthesis. It allowed for heterotrophs to remove the oxygen from the atmosphere, take the energy from the glucose molecule that was produced by our photosynthetic counterparts. We are much more efficient organisms who are heterotrophs over autotrophs. Now, autotrophs, if they don't have the sunlight, they don't make it. I say that we are much more advanced over our photosynthetic counterparts because we're able to process a little bit more. We have higher level thinking, and so we have actual brains and immune systems and things like that, which you don't see in photosynthetic organisms either. And so, so our first cells were organic, had RNA, possible lipid membranes. They're one cell. We have a universal common ancestor to all this. Photosynthesis came before cellular respiration, mainly because we didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere for cellular respiration. So that's kind of an overview of this section. So let's go on to section 5. So this is the evolution of the eukaryotic organism. Hey, this is us. We're eukaryotic organisms. So the first eukaryotic organism came around 2 billion years ago. A whole billion years, or half a billion years, after our first prokaryote. They did it in a process called endosymbiotic theory. Again, a theory. We don't know for sure. There's a lot of controversy on this theory, but it's the best thing that we have for right now. So basically, they had a huge cell come in contact with a smaller cell. It ingested a smaller cell, but instead of breaking it down and using it for food, this larger cell went, this little cell is actually doing something for me. And so it kept it. And when it reproduced, the smaller cell was also reproduced inside the larger cell. So you're like, well, how do we know this theory is true? In our cells right now, in you, we're pretty evolutionary advanced, I feel. You have these cells called mitochondria. They actually have different DNA than your nucleus. Mitochondrial DNA is completely separate. And so we actually know that this DNA comes from your mother. And it is going to be a little bit more advanced. And so we see that this could be this proof that the endosymbiotic theory actually occurred. Now, these eukaryotic organisms, they're all going to have things like organelles, which are membrane bound. They're going to have a nucleus. They a lot of times have DNA. And they'll form what we know as symbiotic relationships with other organisms or other cells. And so, one of the things this endosymbiotic theory allows for us to show the symbiotic relationship between a very large Eukaryotic cell, a very small